Welcome to another episode of The Racing Report. My name is Rob Peeters, and I'm so glad you've decided to tune in for this incredible little half hour where we're going to talk all things motorsports because we've got a lot to talk about this week. We had a lot going on this past week in terms of NASCAR news, some Formula One news. The new calendar is out. We've got to talk about all the fallout between that. Also, we've got a lot of races coming up this weekend. First NASCAR Cup Series race in Mexico City is this weekend, and we've also got the 24 Hours of Le Mans. We're going to get you set up and ready for that coming up later on here in the show. So before we get all into that, go ahead and if you like this show, please follow me on social media. You can do so by looking up at rpeters33. And then if you like the show even more, please be sure to subscribe to WTHR on YouTube and make sure you've got that WTHR Plus app downloaded onto your smart TV so you can get brand new episodes of The Racing Report as soon as they are posted. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right on into the Formula One news of the week because we've got a lot to talk about, and this is the biggest one. The FIA and Formula One management have officially announced the 2026 Formula One calendar, with the season set to begin on March 8th, 2026 in Melbourne, and then conclude on December 6th in Abu Dhabi. Now, here's some of the bigger changes. Imola has been dropped in favor of Madrid, which will now take over the moniker of the Spanish Grand Prix. However, the Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya will still be on the schedule. It just won't be called the Spanish Grand Prix. So that's one big change to be aware of. But the second big change is the one that everybody's talking about right now, and that is the Canadian Grand Prix next year is going to run at basically the exact same time as the 110th Indianapolis 500. Now, this is a very shocking move. A lot of people have been talking about this as being a possibility, and now we certainly know that they have scheduled the race opposite the Indy 500. I don't know if this is going to work out for them the way they think it's going to work out. And a lot of people have a lot of feelings and opinions on this that I'm sure you can find or read about on just about any motorsports site, or even just looking up F1 on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever you use. Lots of controversy going on about this, but here's the thing that's important to keep in mind. This will not be an every year thing. This is only going to happen about once every 5 years, at least under this current agreement, that the Canadian Grand Prix will clash with the Indianapolis 500. Now, Motorsport.com and other outlets have reported that in 2027, it's very likely that the Canadian Grand Prix will take place the week before the Indianapolis 500. So even though we've essentially lost the motorsports Christmas, or as I call it, Racemas, at least it won't be that bad going forward. At least it's just, so far, it's just a one-year thing. So we're trying to look at some of the positives and trying to take a look at some of those bright sides, even though I understand that there's not very many if you are a race fan. And could this be considered, I think, by a lot of people, at least in the IndyCar side, they are kind of calling this an act of war, a declaration of war by Formula One on IndyCar, saying, hey, we are going to infringe on your biggest race and put a race during that time and try and siphon viewers and maybe even fans away from your event. Again, I'm not inherently certain that Formula One did this with 100% malicious intent. I do think that it was mainly done just for the sustainability efforts that they're talking about, but it does feel very strange to go to Miami and then wait 3 weeks before going to Canada. I feel like you could probably shorten that, but the calendar is what it is. It'll be Miami in the first weekend of May, and then the last weekend of May will be the Canadian Grand Prix, with Indianapolis happening in between there, I guess. I digress. It's very interesting and very controversial, but we will have to keep monitoring this as time goes on, and we'll have to keep seeing what really ends up happening next year during the month of May. So, moving on into the next piece of Formula One news that we should talk about today, Red Bull's junior driver Arvid Lindblad has been granted a super license ahead of his upcoming 18th birthday. He's currently 17, but he's set to turn 18 here coming up here in a couple of weeks. But that means he can now participate in free practice sessions or race for either Red Bull or Racing Bulls. So the reason why this is important is because if you watched last week's episode of the Racing Report, we talked about Max Verstappen being very close to a potential race ban. So this is very good for Red Bull to get kind of ahead of that and get one of its up-and-coming junior drivers an opportunity in the event that that race ban does hit Max Verstappen. So that's important to note here. So Arvid Lindblad, he's going to be having a super license. I don't know if or when he'll make an FP1 appearance, but Red Bull definitely is happy to have that little extra security in their back pocket going forward. So final piece of Formula One news here before we move on into some IndyCar news is that Lance Stroll will officially return from injury for his home race at the Canadian Grand Prix coming up this weekend. Stroll, as we talked about last week, Stroll was withdrawn from the Spanish Grand Prix with what Aston Martin called a wrist injury. Now, again, as I talked about, the BBC reported that this might have been caused more by a frustration on the part of Lance Stroll, where he might have maybe punched some things, thrown some things, yelled some things. Again, none of that's been confirmed. It's all hearsay at this point. But there are several different reports of saying that thing. And also, I think this was very interesting. David Croft, who, if you watch Formula One, he's the lead commentator for Sky Sports F1. He was talking on a podcast with Karun Chanduk that was where he said some very interesting things, where he pointed out, well, in Aston Martin's release, their press release about this incident, they said that Lance had been going through this injury for several months. And what's interesting to note is that if that were the case, Crofty said, well, then why didn't they have a standby driver, a driver ready to participate in the event that this happened, that Lance's injuries were flaring up and not going to be, he wouldn't be able to compete in the race. And that is a very good point. It is very strange. A lot of very conflicting details going on with what really happened to Lance Stroll after qualifying for the Spanish Grand Prix. And I'm not sure we'll know, at least in the near future. I think at some point it'll come out, but I don't know when it'll come out. So right now, still just hearsay, but all we do know is that Lance Stroll will be back in the car for Aston Martin beginning this weekend in Montreal. Now let's go ahead and move on into some of the IndyCar news we should talk about, because this is huge ahead of NASCAR's return to Mexico City. Marshall Pruitt and Racer are reporting that talks between IndyCar and the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez are picking up, so much so that it appears to be a foregone conclusion that the series is going to race there at some point in March 2026. But remember, nothing has been confirmed at this time. IndyCar has not announced their next year's schedule. Only a handful of dates are known. The Indy 500, the Arlington Grand Prix, and then the St. Petersburg Grand Prix. I think those are really the only dates that we have solidified right now to kind of plug in for the IndyCar schedule. But it very much seems that between that season opening race in St. Petersburg and when we get to the Arlington Grand Prix, I think they'll probably slot Mexico City in there, likely dropping thermal in the process. Now, again, none of that's been confirmed. That's all kind of just hearsay and rumor right now, but that's what's going on right now in the IndyCar paddock. That's what's being talked about. So kind of interesting to see, especially since this is something that should have happened a long time ago. But at the very least it's finally happening now. Better late than never, I guess, especially when Pato Award is still very popular amongst the Mexican fan base. And I think that IndyCar could probably draw a very, very sizable crowd, and I'm curious to see what that crowd's going to look like this weekend in NASCAR. And NASCAR having Daniel Suarez as well, I think that's going to help a lot. But we'll see. We'll definitely see what that attendance looks like this week for the NASCAR race. But let's talk about some more IndyCar news, talk about mainly some sponsorship news here real quick. Spectrum is going to return to Meyershank Racing and Marcus Armstrong's number 66 for 4 more races this season, beginning this weekend at Gateway, and then later on at Road America, then Mid-Ohio, and finally at Portland. Meanwhile, other sponsorship news, we've got Rahal Letterman Lanigan Racing and a partnership with the company Droplight. They will sponsor Louis Foster for the remaining races of the 2025 IndyCar season. So some good news on the sponsorship front in IndyCar, especially seeing that, hey, there's some profits to be made for these companies, and they're getting some sort of ROI, which is very important when you're trying to sell sponsorship. So let's go ahead real quick and take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to discuss some of the Supercars news and some of the NASCAR news of the weekend before we get into recapping the races of the weekend. So do not go anywhere. You are watching The Racing Report. And welcome back to The Racing Report. My name is Rob Peeters. Let's get you caught up on all of the Supercars news from this weekend, because this is the biggest piece that I am very surprised. Supercars CEO James Warburton has apparently said over the weekend that he is eyeing a separate Asian-based championship to launch in 2027 that would utilize current Supercars Gen 3 chassis. Now, here's what he's basically saying. He's saying, okay, well, you know, he wants to really push into the Asian market. He understands that Supercars is primarily and has always been a strictly Australian and New Zealand championship. But if you've watched Supercars in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, you kind of started to see that series kind of branch out. You saw races in Abu Dhabi, in China, in Malaysia, and even over here in the United States. But you saw them kind of branch out and go to different locations that were relatively close. Obviously, the United States is definitely not close. But when we're talking about maybe Singapore and China, you know, still kind of on the same time zone for Supercars fans. So you kind of saw that a little bit, but it kind of died out after a while. The series didn't return to Texas. And since, I think, 2014-ish, the series has been strictly within the confines of Australia and New Zealand. But what James Warburton is saying now is he thinks that this can be done, but he's got 3 different ways to do it, and he's not exactly sure which way is going to work the best. One of those ways would be a Formula One support series. Another way would try to be some way that that's kind of its own thing, but also kind of mixed together with the current Supercars, but not in a 1-to-1 ratio. It's just a lot of different things being kicked around. Nothing's really set in stone, but that was a pretty big announcement over the weekend. So it's definitely something to keep in mind, and maybe if a completely Asian Supercars series comes around here in the next couple of years. But that is it for this week's Supercars news. Let's talk about some NASCAR news, because this was the biggest piece of NASCAR news. We talked about it last week. We've been talking about these rumors for what feels like forever. Finally, the 4th manufacturer is here. NASCAR announced over the weekend at Michigan's International Speedway that Stellantis is returning to NASCAR under the Ram brand. So if you're unfamiliar, Stellantis is what kind of came out of Daimler Chrysler, and Stellantis now owns the Dodge brand and the Ram brand. Dodge spun off its truck brand as its own thing. It's as Ram, I want to say like right before they got out of NASCAR. And so now they're bringing it back. In 2026, you'll have a Ram truck racing in the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series. And they're targeting, 4 to 6 teams, maybe, if they can get that many. Again, they didn't announce any teams or who the potential drivers would be. Obviously, it's been highly rumored that they might want Cletus McFarland. Again, that's still hearsay. Nothing was announced in that regard. But again, keep in mind that the series is pursuing a Cup Series debut as well. It's just the question is, what is that going to look like? And I talked a little bit about that on my podcast this weekend. It's the Racing with Rob and Roller podcast. You can go ahead and look at that up wherever you get your podcasts, so you could kind of hear what me and my co-host Josh Roller are kind of kicking around as what might be the plan for Dodge when it eventually does get back to the Cup Series. But what's interesting here is that is not the only piece of new manufacturer news that we have to talk about. NASCAR appears bullish on another manufacturer, not just Dodge, but another manufacturer that could come into the Cup Series in the near future and maybe even get an announcement later on this year. But again, no details have been formally announced. Now, let's talk about the rumors, though, to kind of see what might be happening. So, as we've talked a bit during this show, the last couple of months, Honda and IndyCar are not exactly on the right page right now. They're in a very, very rocky part of their relationship, and Honda could be looking to maybe walk at the end of their contract. And if that does happen, the hot rumor is that they would reallocate those funds into a NASCAR program, which is probably why NASCAR is not announcing anything, probably why you're not going to see anything until if, I should say, not until, but if that relationship between Honda and IndyCar does fall apart. Again, I hope that doesn't happen. That'd be worst case scenario for IndyCar. But again, Honda has been begging Roger Penske and begging even before Roger Penske, begging the Holmans and the previous administration, please give us a third manufacturer so that we don't have to make engines for half the cars on the grid. Continuously, that plea has fallen on deaf ears. IndyCar has not made any advancements on getting a third OEM. They have continuously talked about it, but it has just never happened. This could be the fallout of that. But again, remember, this is all rumors. Take all of it with a grain of salt. But this is what's going on right now, especially in the aftermath of Dodge's announcement over the weekend. Now, let's talk about something else that was really big in the world of NASCAR this weekend, and that's the 2311 and Front Row Motorsports lawsuit against NASCAR. Some big changes and big updates to report in the past week. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit in North Carolina ruled against the preliminary injunction that was granted earlier this year that allowed 2311 and FRM the right to compete as chartered entries. So this is huge. This could have major ramifications on how FRM and 2311 do business and what the driver market could even look like. Because keep in mind, this could be the end of the road for some contracts if this ends up being null and void. If the preliminary injunction, if all of these deadlines pass that we're going to talk about in a little bit, you could end up seeing 2311 and FRM be forced to operate as open teams. And if that ends up being the case, sponsors can walk, drivers can walk, a lot of things can get very messy very fast. And I'll be curious to see what Jeffrey Kessler, the attorney representing both 2311 and FRM, has to say. Obviously, he issued a statement saying he was disappointed in the ruling. But here's what's really interesting to me. Judge Paul Niemeyer said the injunction that was granted earlier this year had, quote, no legal basis. So now we've got another judge looking and saying what this first judge said and said, no, that is not worthy of a preliminary injunction that has no legal basis on it. And so as a result of that ruling, what's going to have to happen is within at least the next 14 days, FRM and 2311 are going to have to appeal and petition for a rehearing. And if that happens, then the judgment from that petition would have to be heard within 7 days, which means we could know whether or not these teams are going to be competing as chartered or open teams by Atlanta, which is just 3-ish races away, if you can believe that. So a lot of things are moving really fast. 2311 and FRM really need to start moving fast on those legal proceedings to make sure they keep their charters, because the question then becomes, what happens with those charters? What happens with those drivers? What happens with those sponsors? Everything could change immediately. Obviously, it's assumed that NASCAR would just take back the charters, but would they sell them back to 2311 or FRM? Probably not. What would end up happening? Where would those charters go? All of this. Crazy. We're going to have to watch it. And again, like I said, remember, keep it right here on the Racing Report, because we're going to have every single update with the NASCAR lawsuit versus 2311 and FRM as we know it. So just keep it here and we'll keep you updated as we go. Now let's talk about some of the final pieces of NASCAR news before we take our final break of the show. NASCAR will have podium ceremonies this weekend at Mexico City, so that'll be kind of cool to get to see some podium ceremonies in a NASCAR race. I don't think we've ever seen that, but that's first time for everything, and I think it'll be welcomed by some and maybe hated by others. Who knows? We'll find out. And then finally, Motorsports Business Management, MBM, Carl Long's NASCAR team, has announced that they will return to Truck Series competition in 2 weeks' time, coming up at Pocono on June 20th, with driver Tyler Tomasi. He's going to drive the number 69 Ford F-150 in that race for MBM. So some good news there. The christening, I guess, of their truck team. So Now let's go ahead and take another break, our final break of the show. And when we come back, we're going to recap the NASCAR weekend in Michigan and look ahead to all of the races that are coming up this weekend across the world of motorsports. So don't go anywhere. You are watching The Racing Report. And welcome back to The Racing Report. My name is Rob Peeters. Let's get you caught up on everything that happened over the weekend in Michigan. The NASCAR weekend in Michigan came and went. Let me tell you something. I was up there this weekend as a fan. What a race, what a crowd, what an atmosphere. Michigan Speedway does a great job every single time of putting on one heck of a race. And honestly, I was impressed with every race I saw. I only saw the truck in the Cup race. Wasn't able to get to the ARCA race on Friday, but I did see the truck in the Cup race. And honestly, not bad. But I will say, here's something that I noticed during the Cup race. And this is coming from somebody who's gone to Michigan races since about 2022. So almost basically every single next-gen race at Michigan I have seen. And one of the things that became very obvious to me throughout the weekend was the Gen 7 car and the dirty air that it creates. Because I was looking back at some of the footage that I had recorded on my phone from previous races that I went to, like 24, 23, 22. And in all those races, you could really see the cars get up and draft and be able to pull alongside and pass. Even though it looked a little bit difficult, it still looked a lot easier during previous years than it did on Sunday. And that really surprised me. There was many moments throughout that race where you would see a car get an insane run coming off turn 4 or an insane run coming off turn 2. And as soon as they got to the rear bumper of the car in front, they would just stall out. The car, you could visibly see the car just lose all of its momentum as soon as it got to the rear end of the car in front. And I think seeing that and having such a visual example of how frustrating it can be to drive with these next-gen cars now, even though I think the race was great. Denny Hamlin, winner there. It was essentially a fuel mileage race with William Byron running out with a couple of laps to go. A lot of things going on. Carson Hocevar probably could have, should have, and would have won that race had he not have a tire go down with only a handful of laps to go. But either way, that definitely looked to be a problem. Now, don't get me wrong. There was still plenty of side-by-side racing. It was very clear that you could race side-by-side. But when you were talking about two cars maybe on equal tires with equal fuel, then it got a little bit more difficult. Now, again, it wasn't impossible, but it was more difficult than maybe it was in previous years. So I think that's something really interesting that NASCAR is going to have to look back on and really see, because when you have such a visual difference from year to year, fans are going to notice that, and fans are going to pick up on that. And I think for NASCAR's sake, I think they really need to do something sooner rather than later about this dirty air problem that is really causing what I think could be really fun racing from happening. And the reason why I say that is because now that we talk about the truck race had a lot of that. The truck race had a lot of instances of drivers quite literally tandem drafting down the front stretch and back stretch, and then just doing huge dive bombs into turn 1 or into turn 3 and using a slide job to get up front and take the lead away. There was some great racing in that truck race. I was very impressed from the moment the green flag fell. I was entertained the entire time. Again, I'm there half as a fan, not really cheering on anybody. I'm really mainly there just because I like to go to races, and I don't care who wins. I just want to see a good race. I want to have a good time. I want to experience the racetrack, and Michigan's a great track to do that at. So if you're living here in Indianapolis, I do highly recommend getting up to seeing a NASCAR race in Michigan. Might be better than the Brickyard sometimes. Just saying. Doug Bowles, I didn't say that, I promise. Actually, the Brickyard last year was pretty fun too, but either way. I just think it's very interesting to see the difference. And even in the ARCA race, I think the ARCA race, you saw a lot more kind of cutthroat racing, close side-by-side racing. Brendan Queen winning that, Butterbean getting the win, and then Stuart Friesen in the Truck Series winning a triple overtime race. And I don't even think Friesen expected to finish where he finished at all. I don't even think he expected to get a top 5. I know I didn't expect that, but then all of a sudden when the final caution happens and he's right up there up front, I'm like, all right, this could be Friesen's time. And sure enough, it was. And it's good for him because that's probably one of the closest truck races to the Canadian border that Stuart Friesen is going to be able to get to race. So that's kind of cool for him. But in general, a great weekend at Michigan, and I'm really looking forward to next year. But let's talk about some of the races that are coming up this weekend. Let's get you set up for that. Like I talked about earlier, NASCAR is going to south of the border to Mexico City. It'll be the first time the Cup race has ever raced in Mexico, but it'll be the first time the Xfinity Series has raced in Mexico since 2008. They stopped going there after that season, but they had raced there for several seasons prior, I believe beginning in 2005, going back 2006, 7, and then finally in 2008. Looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a really fun event and a cool race to see. I'm very curious to see what these Cup cars and even the Xfinity cars do now on this kind of new Tilkedrome. No, I'm not going to call it a Tilkedrome, even though kind of it was redesigned by Herman Tilke for Formula One when the Mexico Grand Prix was revived for the 2015 season, excuse me. So I'm curious to see how the track's going to race for NASCAR, both Cup and Xfinity. I'm very curious to see that. Something also to keep in mind this weekend is that Denny Hamlin is on baby watch. Now, probably by the time you're watching this, it'll already been decided, but if his fiancée Jordan Fish does not go into labor by Thursday, he is not going to race, and it will be Ryan Truex in the Mexico City race coming up this weekend. Now, that is primarily so that Denny can be with his fiance when she gives birth and not have to worry about flying back over the border and dealing with customs and dealing with all of that. It's probably just safer for him to just stay in the stateside, be with his fiance, let Ryan Truex get his Cup start and be with that. But if Denny Hamlin's son decides to come sooner rather than later, he'll be there. But anything could happen at this point. So now, the Truck Series will not return this weekend to Mexico City, but they will return in 2 weeks at Pocono. And now let's talk about the IndyCar Series. The IndyCar is coming up this weekend at Gateway. Looking forward to that. That'll be a Sunday night race. Get your tickets now if you haven't already. If you weren't in Michigan last weekend like I was and you still have money left over, highly recommend heading down I-70 and going to Worldwide Technology Raceway at Gateway. I think that's going to be a really great race, really fun race, always a fun time, and it'll be an oval race. So, yeah, you got to get tickets to that because they're a dying breed and we need more ovals on the IndyCar schedule. So please make sure that there's a good crowd on Sunday so that maybe we can continue to get good oval races back on the IndyCar schedule. The question now during that race is who's going to win? Is it going to be Alex Palou? You know, because he's only ever won one oval race before, and it was earlier this year at the Indianapolis 500. I say earlier this year, I mean literally just a couple of weeks ago that he won his first ever oval race. Can he do it again? That's what I'd be curious to see. Or can somebody else dethrone Alex Palou? Maybe it'll be Pato O'Ward. He's always fast on an oval, but we'll see. It could be somebody else. Could be Penske Redemption. Maybe Newgarden gets back into victory lane. I don't know. It's kind of an open field right now. We'll just have to see. And then we've got Formula One heading to the Canadian Grand Prix, thankfully. Not clashing with the Indy 500, but it is clashing with Le Mans this weekend. We've got the 24 Hours of Le Mans coming up this weekend. I believe the entire race should be aired on Motor Trend, but I believe you can also stream it on Max. So there's at least a couple of different ways to watch the entirety of that race. Highly recommend it. Always love Le Mans. Can't get enough of Le Mans. I'm super excited. The hypercar field this year looks really stacked, and I'm really excited to see what who's gonna come out on top at the end of 24 hours. Something big to keep in mind, though, that we should talk about is we've got another Penske cheating scandal, and I know it's a bad time to end the show talking about something like that, but at the end of the qualifying session, the number 6 Penske Porsche car, which is going to be driven by Kevin Estre, Lawrence Vanthoor, and Matt Campbell, was disqualified from qualifying. So they were ineligible to run the Hyperpole, and they will be moved to the rear of the hypercar class grid after failing to make minimum weight. So that number 6 Penske Porsche car is going to start dead last in class, not dead last in the field, but dead last in the hypercar class. So I'll be very curious to see if that car is able to make its way up through the field, even though it does look very fast. But I'm just excited. It's going to be a fun weekend of Le Mans, just fun weekend of racing in general. I think, you start the day by watching Le Mans on Saturday and, keep watching that all the way through. And then basically by the time Le Mans is done, we should be ready to go racing in Mexico City and then in Canada. So whatever your preference is there. And then we're going to finish the day. Remember, it's a Sunday night race, IndyCar at Gateway. So a lot of things to look forward to this weekend. So thank you again so much for watching this weekend's episode of The Racing Report. We appreciate all the support that you've given us. And we'll be back next week to recap all the races I'm talking about and get you ready for the new races and also bring you all the latest news and notes in the world of motorsports. So we'll see you guys next week. My name is Rob Peeters, and this has been The Racing Report.